are very excited to host our first virtual lecture with all of you, titled The Great American Outdoors Act, a Big Win for Environmental Conservation. Today's topic will be presented by Garrett Wallace, TNC Florida's Government Relations Director. So without further ado, Garrett, let me hand it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all so much for taking time to join us today. I'm Garrett Wallace. I head up the government relations effort for the Nature Conservancy. I'm based in the Tallahassee office and spend a lot of time downtown in our state capital. Just very briefly, I've worked on environmental issues here in Florida since 1997. I worked for both the St. Johns and South Florida Water Management District during my career, and also worked for the largest citrus grower in North America. So as many TNC employees, you will find we've got diverse backgrounds, but we all share a very consistent common love for the state of Florida, preserving our precious state. So I was real happy to get this opportunity to talk with y'all today about the Great American Outdoors Act. And what I'd like to do just briefly is tell you a little bit about what makes up the Great American Outdoors Act. So we'll begin with talking on the act itself. For more than 10 years, myself and many folks across the United States have worked to build a permanent funding mechanism for land acquisition and land management within the federal processes. And in August of 2020, that crazy year, one really important piece of legislation was signed by the president, and that is the Great American Outdoors Act. The Great American Outdoors Act itself takes many places in our federal sequencing of conservation, public lands, outdoor recreation. And what occurred in August was truly a once-in-a-generation victory for public lands and conservation. And it's the culmination, literally, of 55 years. That's how long we've been doing this in the federal system, 55 years of conservation. And I think it's really important to note that in our current world, this particular piece of legislation had wide bipartisan support across the federal government and our members of Congress. So the Great American Outdoors Act itself provides $900 million a year worth of federal funding for land acquisition. So imagine Everglades National Park, the Apalachicola National Forest, things like that have been acquired using LWCF funds. And for its first time since its establishment 55 years ago, we have a consistent annual revenue stream dedicated to land acquisition. Another really super important part of the bill is an investment of $1.9 billion for the next 5 years towards land management and maintenance on national parks and public lands. I can't overstate how important it is that we support the actual management. So often we talk about conserving land and we consistently forget that we've got to take care of it. And this second piece of this bill offered a really significant investment in taking care of our precious properties. Now, the LWCF portion of the Great American Outdoors Act has been supported for a long time, and LWCF is funded not necessarily by tax dollars, but by offshore oil and gas revenues. So we'll talk about that probably a little bit later, but I did want to acknowledge that straight out of the gate, that's how this is funded. And so this type of victory had a lot of champions, and I can tell you personally that there are more than 1,000 stakeholder groups that came together to get this type of legislation passed. Another important part of the bill is something that people don't often think about, is the economic impact of what this type of investment does. And what we'll find is that the job creation and local economy reconstruction that occurs with state lands, because every dollar that's invested in state lands, or excuse me, in federal lands, returns a $4 investment per the Outdoor Recreation Society. Outdoor Recreation Association, excuse me, let me get that straight. Now in Florida, as I'd mentioned, I've worked for water management districts in my previous life. And I think a lot of folks don't realize how far-reaching the Land and Water Conservation Fund has been within the state of Florida. So if you can imagine, basically from Monroe County in the Florida Keys to Escambia County, there is hardly a county that goes by that hasn't had some success in using land and water conservation funds from the Great American Outdoors Act. And in Florida alone, 1.026 billion with a B LWCF funding has been dedicated in the last 55 years. So from Everglades National Park to Big Cypress to the Canaveral Seashore to St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, all of these pieces of property have been preserved and protected. Another important part, though, is I think a lot of folks on this call may be very familiar with the Florida Scenic Trail, or some folks just call it the Florida Trail. And that's 1,100 miles of hiking from Big Cypress to Gulf Islands National Seashore. $18 million of LWCF funding just in 1 year in 1966 established that, and 300 more miles of trail are still in limbo and needing protection. So you can count that TNC will be advocating and helping get those last 300 miles of that trail protected. And I think you're going to continue to see that the implementation success that we've enjoyed in the past, we're leveraging that for the future to try to get this part put together and find new ways to dedicate a lot of resources to it. So I was going to talk kind of specifically about one of the oldest refuges in the National Wildlife System, and that's the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge that has been protected using Great American Outdoors Act and Land and Water Conservation funding. So the St. Mark's Refuge, south of Tallahassee on the Gulf, is over 70,000 acres between McCullough, Jefferson, and Taylor counties. It's basically 43 miles of coastline in Northwest Florida, and this refuge has a huge diversity of coastal marshes, tidal creeks, estuaries, and then 7 North Florida rivers flow into the Gulf in this particular pass. Also really important and very significant is the St. Mark's Lighthouse, and I hope if you haven't seen it, you put that on your list of places to see. That lighthouse was constructed in 1842, recently rehabbed and refurbished, and is still in use today. So those are examples of all the different places that we love to talk about. I'm also going to kind of reach out to some other places because I'm not sure where y'all are from in terms of folks joining us, but let's also talk about specific places in Clay County. There's a place called the Northeast Florida Timberlands that is a part of the Florida Legacy Program. These protecting working forests, and the Nature Conservancy has a consistent position that working forests are a great thing to keep, both for water quality within the state of Florida, and of course, the value of carbon sequestration that comes along with keeping those trees. Now, I've mentioned it briefly before, but I want to talk a little bit more about how the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Great American Outdoors Act have economic benefits. So in Florida, it's estimated from, again, the Outdoor Industry Association that 38.3 billion with a B consumer dollars are spent in Florida in outdoor recreation. And they also report that 329,000 jobs across the state of Florida generate approximately $10.7 billion in wages and salaries and $2.5 billion in state and local revenues. And the United States Census reports that approximately 7 million people hunt, fish, or do wildlife watching in an ecotourism manner in the course of a calendar year. And so that's about $8.1 billion in wildlife recreation spending to our state economy. And as I think everyone probably knows, we've had such dramatic impacts to Florida's economy over the past year as a result of COVID-19 that reestablishing our commitment and our time spent on lands is, frankly, for me personally, it's been a very precious thing to be able to socially distance in McCullough Springs State Park, just south of Tallahassee. So those are the exact economic impacts. And so we feel that the investment of the federal dollars are simply going to expand and continue to grow the economic impact of conservation, recreation on Florida lands. One thing I did want to mention, though, that has been an interesting challenge has been the implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So the bill was passed out of the Congress and again signed by the president, as I mentioned, in August. And with the new fiscal year that began September 1st, we continue to help prioritize land and water conservation spending within the state of Florida. And there was an interesting implementation act that took place as the previous administration was rolling out the actual how we're going to get this money on the ground. And what we have found were some administrative challenges that were put in place in the outgoing administration that would have allowed local governments, for example, to be required to support and approve an individual transaction. So let's say landowner X has decided and reached a willing seller agreement with the federal government. A piece of, I'm not sure how the right way to say it, but implementation language from the Department of Interior required that the local government had to approve it and could get canceled. And that was certainly never the legislative intent. And so we are currently acting with the new staff rolling into our federal agencies who execute these programs to correct that misinterpretation of the legislative intent of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and help ensure that we are getting this project underway as quickly as we can. I'd like to talk a little bit about some priorities regarding future expansion that are priorities of the Nature Conservancy when it comes to the Land and Water Conservation Fund itself. And since many of you are likely followers of the Nature Conservancy in Florida and some of the great work that we've done, you may recall that very recently we helped the state of Florida close on the acquisition of a piece of property in the Panhandle called the Bluffs of St. Teresa. And the Bluffs of St. Teresa is approximately 17,000 acres that was purchased, excuse me, by the state that completes or helps connect a giant habitat corridor within the Panhandle. So kind of going from Taylor County, the Parrot area, up through the Big Bend into Apalachicola. We're continuing to work with that, and we still have inholdings and places in the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge where we have still lapses in ownership in the federal system. So one priority for future expenditures of Land and Water Conservation Fund are going to be helping complete the footprint, the build out, not the build out, wrong term, sorry. Completing the footprint of the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge and continue to make that property whole. And one thing that is really important that we don't talk about enough when it comes to the St. Mark's is the great coastal resilience and natural climate solutions that piece of property offers. It's always a position of the Nature Conservancy that, natural climate solutions are a great way to prevent human impacts from natural disasters, and having that coastline protected provides an amazing buffer for inland properties. As we've in Florida, let's face it, we're going to have another storm. It's just a matter of time till it gets here. So let's have all of the natural climate solutions in place that we can. Now, Kate, if it's okay, I'd like to pause for just a second and see if there's questions. I'm afraid I've not been monitoring the chat, but if anybody has any questions, I'd love to take a shot at answering them.
Yes, absolutely. Kristen, will you lead us in that?
Certainly, Garrett. Hi, it's Kristen down at Blowing Rocks. And we did actually have a question that was submitted in advance of today's lecture. And this is something that you touched on a little bit, and maybe you can help elaborate for us. The question that was submitted is, please explain more about the LWCF's main source of funding, which is the fossil fuel industry. Isn't this counterproductive? Thank
you, Kristen. That's a great question. And it's one that I'd like to flesh out just a little bit for us. So, and I'm going to use an example at the end of my explanation to try to make sense of this. So as a part of license agreements within the petroleum industry within the United States, 55 years ago, it was decided that a portion of those funds to begin to offset the impacts of oil and gas in the United States would be dedicated and collected by the federal government. And so it is, I think, a pretty well understood fact that we are not in the immediate future going to get away from the internal combustion engine, although we will one day get away from that. But today that funding is still there, and it is best for us to use the receipts paid for by oil and gas to begin to try to self-mitigate to the degree that we can some of the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. The best example that I can show that is kind of a counterpoint, and it's sometimes often seen disingenuous when I share this example, but when the terrible Deepwater Horizon spill took place in the Gulf of Mexico 10 years ago, a funding mechanism has been put in place by the producer who was responsible for that ecologic disaster. And that created something called Restore. And we have leveraged and worked with the Restore dollars paid for from a fine, a very large fine, from an oil and gas producer to correct and begin to fix the problems created by that result. So until there is such a time when the oil and gas demands aren't there, let's leverage that money that exists. Let's find a way to put it back into conservation. And it's quite simply better than the alternative. And until a time comes when we have to look for other revenue streams, not to go too far down a climate path, but finding a price for carbon someday is going to have to be something that this nation comes to some kind of understanding on how we can get to that point. Utilizing revenues from the oil and gas industry for conservation is a sound thing. So Kristen, do you think that kind of helped shape that question or an answer to that question a little bit better?
Yeah, to me it did. And if anybody was seeking additional information or clarification, I would certainly welcome them to unmute themselves and ask, or also you could type it into the question and I'd be happy to ask it on your behalf.
And John White, if you're there, I see your question about Henry County. That agriculture company I used to work for, you may know if you're familiar with Henry County. I worked for Alico. I was their government affairs director, and we had groves not too far from that Henry County Correctional Institute that you were mentioning. So we'll make sure you get connected with those folks.
And I haven't seen any other questions come into the chat. Kate, is it correct that folks can unmute themselves if they wish to ask a question?
Yes, absolutely. If someone would like to ask their own question, you're welcome to do so now.
All right, if not, we can carry on, Garrett, and then we'll certainly have time at the end for more questions.
Great. Well, one thing I've kind of wanted to further talk about, and in today's, at least in my part of today's life, we need to talk about the bipartisan nature of support for the Great American Outdoors Act. And I have been working in a variety of capacities with the Florida Congressional Delegation since 2008. And one thing that I think it's always important to know through all of the partisan discussions that are out there today, Florida enjoys very broad support from our congressional delegation when it comes to conservation, when it comes to Everglades protection, and when it comes to water quality protection. And it's really important to note that 18 members of the Florida Congressional Delegation voted to support the Great American Outdoors Act, and having Republicans and Democrats come together to support conservation, I think, is something that we'll need to continue to use as an example. And in the, frankly, I think some of the division that occurs today in the nation, we can counteract that because so often we see folks coming together. And I have to say quite candidly that as we began 2020 working on the Great American Outdoors Act, as that year rolled on, my optimism for passing of the Great American Outdoors Act waned several times during the course of the year. But it was a testament to me of how strong and solid the value of the bill was to get it through the House, through the Senate, and to the president's desk. And I bring all this up because I think it's important that as constituents to someone who has been elected to office, it is really critical that you continue to share what's important to you and your family with your elected officials. And I can say personally that members of the Florida Congressional Delegation had amazing outreach from Floridians urging their support of the Great American Outdoors Act, because some of the properties that we've talked about that are in, that were acquired using land and water conservation funding are very dear to constituents. And so it's important that I kind of pass along to you, at least my interpretation and my impression, that it's really important that as constituents, you do make sure that your elected officials know how important conservation is and how it needs to be prioritized. And as we continue to work through Everglades restoration, whether we're working on water quality, whether it's Northern Everglades, getting water stored north of the lake, all of these come together that I simply think makes Florida even better place to live. And if you'll bear with me while I have too many tabs open on my computer. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit more, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Excuse me, I got two other priorities that I missed that I wanted to talk about. The other conservation priorities for the organization as we continue to work towards is the Northern Everglades Headwaters Refuge. That was established back in 2007, and the Nature Conservancy, as I believe Kate pointed out, or excuse me, Kristen pointed out, the Disney Wilderness Preserve, located south of Orlando, south of Kissimmee, is a total 15,000 acre preserve. We partnered with Disney, and adjacent to that was the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. And TNC literally donated the land to get that refuge underway, and continue to expand the conservation area in the Metro Orlando area is another huge priority that we'll continue to support. Also, Casperson Beach in Sarasota County and the Cape Florida State Recreation Area in Dade County are big priorities that we'd like to continue to work towards. And one thing I would like to encourage y'all as folks with an interest in the Nature Conservancy is there are priorities that you think the Nature Conservancy should consider in terms of working for future land and water conservation efforts. We certainly always welcome the input of our donors and our members to find ways to help benefit more Floridians even more. And Kate and Kristen, I think I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I have exhausted my outline of notes because I probably talked too fast. Well, I know I talked too fast, but that covers the points that I wanted to make today.
Great, thank you for all of that. Oh, my service gone out a bit, but Kristen, I'll pass it off to you for questions.
Absolutely. We do have a question that came into the chat from Ryan Paul. And that question is, beyond funding acquisition of land, does the Great American Outdoors Act actually fund staffing, management, and restoration?
It's sure. Let me qualify that question. Management and restoration, yes, not staffing. The staffing would be held and funded through the typical tax collection revenues that the Department of Interior pays their staff with. And the land management, land enhancement. So it may sound mundane, but the maintenance of a parking lot and the restroom facilities at a national park would be funded by that $1.9 billion funding stream that was created And sadly, we have a massive, massive maintenance backlog on national lands. And that 1.9 billion over 5 years was simply to get us caught up. And future funding beyond that 5 years will be required to keep our land going. But this is not a staffing thing. This is truly land management. The gravel for the parking lot, the new wood to build the outhouse. That's what this money is for.
Well, I can just comment as an aside, Garrett. I don't think anybody considers restrooms mundane. I think those are a very good necessity that people would appreciate. I know here at Blowing Rocks, they do.
Well, and those trailheads are kind of important to keep you on the right trail as you're going. And when they get knocked down, they need to be put back so we aren't wandering around the forest lost.
Yes. And again, I would certainly welcome any of the participants to unmute yourselves. You know, we were very sad, of course, that we couldn't see you all in person this year, because we really appreciate all of the wonderful interaction and back and forth that our lecture guests always get to have with the speakers. So we definitely wanted to give people an opportunity to do that, even in this virtual format. And if you're having any challenges unmuting yourself, you can, you know, wave your hands wildly or some other motion and we can help you.
Well, Garrett, I actually had a question while we wait for others to submit theirs. So, like we've mentioned, the Great American Outdoors Act has been something that has been trying to make headway for decades. Is there anything or any priority that stands out to you that you're looking forward to most, or that you can't wait to have initiated?
The one big priority for Garrett Wallace personally is filling in those end holdings in the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, as I mentioned earlier. That is so important and so critical to finally connect those habitat corridors that we need to have connected. I think you'll see in the Florida chapter's work, like in the Panther corridor down in Southwest Florida, the criticality of making sure each one of those pieces connects, that we've got that property going in and protecting and conserving that for the Florida Panther. That exact same situation occurs here in the Panhandle and connecting those things. TNC's had an amazing effort over the last 4 years to reintroduce this indigo snake, for example, here in the Panhandle, and make sure that we've got the right habitat. Yep, it's just one snake and not everybody's a snake fan, but it's really important to have that habitat in place. And so that's my big priority. That continues to be a priority of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and we continue to work towards that. So that's what I think is important for us right now.
Okay. And my follow-up question would be, what do you think is the biggest hurdle that we'll have to overcome carrying, now that we have this funding? So step one is figured out. What do you think the biggest hurdle will be using it?
Outreach to landowners. It is always a challenge, and pardon the cliche, but I'm here from the government and I'm here to help, is something that a lot of landowners won't find a lot of comfort in. And one thing, if I may say, I think TNC is very good at bringing folks together. And so if we can continue to work with willing sellers and landowners in highlighted priority regions and provide an introduction to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service staff, that is always the biggest concern, particularly in my professional history working in South Florida for so many years. Those introductions are sometimes hard to connect. And so it's my hope that the TNC will continue to work with landowners who have an interest in helping make that connection happen.
Garrett, we've had a couple of additional questions come into the chat. I'm going to jump first to a first-time question asker, who is Mark Jackson. He asks, is there an educational component, for example, scholarships or internships with students? And Mark is actually coming to us from Lynn University in Boca Raton.
Go Lynn. I used to live in Delray, just for the fact, so I know right what we're talking about. But unfortunately, there aren't educational opportunities with this particular category. This is strictly for land acquisition, conservation, and land management. So I'm sorry, that's a no on the question. but having more land and more opportunity out there provides more internship capacities at the service. It is my hope that at the Nature Conservancy, within our time frame of coming out of some of the impacts of COVID, we can expand our internships and get more opportunities for that type of education and outreach on the ground.
And I can chime in with some support for that, Garrett. Certainly all of us at the preserves that Kate mentioned are really eager to be resuming and then growing the internship opportunities that we have for high school, undergrad, and graduate students in the state. And then we had another question from Ryan Paul, who asks, so who determines management or restoration for the newly purchased tracts of land? Are third-party vendors hired that specialize in such conservation activities?
Typically, the answer to that question is the technical staff of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and their biologists. Through the acquisition and land management process, that is a public process where the public is encouraged to weigh in. But in full disclosure, the ultimate management restoration nexus is decided upon by the scientific staff of the service. And I can say personally, I don't find that they make a bad choice. They are experts in their field. They are very consistent in wanting to protect that land. As refuge managers have told me over the years, you know, they consider this their baby, and then they want to do what's right by it. I hope you weren't hearing my dogs just then. We've named them the wireless doorbells during COVID. I'm so sorry about that. Well, I couldn't mute myself fast enough.
Garrett, I actually have a question. This is Rachel. I was impressed with the fact that we had so much bipartisan support for the Great American Outdoors Act. And can you talk to us a little bit about what does TNC do on the ground specifically to garner this level of bipartisan support for legislation for the conservation initiatives that we support?
Well, thank you, Rachel. I think how we foster participation and coordination is literally working with and meeting with members of Congress. A quick example that I mentioned the Disney Wilderness Preserve earlier. That is in the district of Representative Darren Soto. So that's Florida's 17th congressional district, I believe. And so during my chats with Representative Soto and his staff, we talked about the Disney Wilderness Preserve, and lo and behold, during a recess week, when he has all of his staff come together and all the Washington staff come to Florida, we were very fortunate to be able to host Representative Soto and his entire staff for a tour of the Disney Wilderness Preserve so that all of his constituents could see what I've been raving about for these years when I talk to them. And going down and sitting with members and telling them the story of what you're trying to do. And frankly, if I may say, it reinforces the point I made earlier about making sure your elected officials know what's important to you and communicating with them, and having that type of connection and letting those people see what we do really resonates with them. And frankly, being in front of their face, I mean, pre-COVID, I was in Washington about 6 times a year. We'd meet with them, we'd sit down, we'd tell them what's going on. Since I live in Tallahassee, it's very easy for me to go to, for example, the local offices of Senator Rubio and Senator Scott. They all have district staff here in Tallahassee. We're able to keep them communicated with them in our local district offices. And so the simple act of relationship management, while that may sound like a cliche, it's very true that we are factual, direct with our members of Congress. We provide the sound science, the data to back up what it is that we're trying to ask them to do. And frankly, our delegation, we are so fortunate that they see the inherent value of the beauty of Florida and its conservation, and getting them, Republicans and Democrats, whether they're on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee or the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee, they get it. And so if I just make that pitch one more time, your elected officials need to hear what's important to you. So Rachel, I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thank you.
Garrett, this is Margaret Demansky in Vero Beach, and my husband and I spent a lot of time living in the Florida Keys and moved up to the Treasure Coast 5 years ago. The environments are very different here. That's been fascinating for us, but I'm wondering how the Nature Conservancy deals with the sort of competing demands to get their hands on some of these funds to advance the conservation efforts in an area such as the Keys, as opposed to the Treasure Coast, as opposed to the inland area where the Kissimmee preserves are, etc.
That's a great question, Margaret. Thank you so much. One of the tools I use, and the Keys is a great example of that, is where TNC is going to focus our priorities is where we might be able to leverage things. So if you lived in the Keys recently, or in recent history, you recall the conversion of septic to sewer. So we had to get a sewer system in the Keys. And so Ileana Ross-Layton at the time was the member of Congress who represented that part of Monroe County. And we knew that her commitment to the Keys was amazing and vast, and we needed to get to work. So using that particular project as an example, leveraging state funds and federal funds was an easy fit to help us prioritize how we can improve water quality in the Keys by helping do our little part to convert septic to sewer in the Keys, as one example. Today, it's a similar situation as to where we can leverage funds. So let me talk a little bit about inland for a second. So I worked at the South Florida Water Management District for years, and I had a lot of experience working with hurricane recovery after the 2004-2005 hurricane seasons, as an example. So we had Hurricane Irma come through in 17, made a mess of so many things, but we were able to seek projects that would qualify for a conservation value that could be funded from disaster recovery from Hurricane Michael. And through this program called Community-Based Development Block Grants, CDBG grants, there are huge throws of money that will come available that will be more sustainability oriented. And one thing that I personally always have great concern about is the sustainability of Florida's drinking water supply. And so the city of Winter Haven has a project that is helping to diversify and sustain their water supply. We were able to find a match between a CDB grant and connect the city of Winter Haven with the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity that are responsible for spending that money within the state of Florida, and help those people connect, so that if we could find a funding stream to help the city of Winter Haven that was impacted by Hurricane Michael, that had huge problems as a result of that, finding ways to leverage that. So Margaret, I think the kind of take-home message is we'll put our priorities where we think we can get the biggest bang for the buck. Mm-hmm. Bring some technical expertise, some data, some relationships, and help people connect. That sometimes helps drive the priority, if that answers your question.
It does. And I just, in terms of Rachel's question about how do you get your elected officials involved, Ileana Ross-Layton, who my husband and I had the pleasure of meeting personally when we lived in Key West, was an incredible advocate for the Keys, and she was a Republican.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Many people thought that would never be possible. A lifelong Republican of Cuban American heritage, a phenomenal woman. So you just have to find that common interest and common benefit to your constituents. She was a fabulous advocate for the Keys. We were all very sorry when she actually, the Keys got dropped out of her district on redistricting. Yes. But yeah, she was a phenomenal advocate and still is for conservation.
And Margaret, if I can just share with you, she had an amazing number of excellent staff members rotate through her office during her many, many years in Washington. And to this day, although they have all moved on, I still communicate very regularly with about 15 people who have worked for Ileana. And that kind of talks about the relationship. They may now be at the Department of Energy or at the Department of Transportation or working for another member, but that kind of matrix helps in terms of the longstanding relationships that continue to give a focus and help me, even in a transportation setting, find, that climate resilience can be talked about because TNC can do that because this person we just happen to know worked for Ileana back in 2006.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'm just going to give it maybe a few more seconds to allow anyone else that would like to speak up the chance and space to do so.
Well, if I can, just thank y'all so much for letting me ramble on about the Great American Outdoors Act. It's a great success story. We hope to see some examples of that success rolling out, and we'll be promoting that on the chapter social media feeds and through our newsroom at tnc.org/Florida. We thank you for taking that time and your commitment to helping conserve Florida. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Kate.